what these people often are facing is live every day as if you could become a martyr today. And I think that that is a remarkable difference. And when we see them, we say, wow, that is how powerful the faith can be. Whereas in the West, we tend to think of it as just like an option that a person can choose. These people bet their lives on the faith.
Welcome to the Break the Silence podcast, brought to you by Aid to the Church in Need, the Catholic charity helping persecuted and other suffering Christians around the world. Please follow our podcast on your favorite platform. I'm Amy Balog, the marketing executive at Aid to the Church in Need UK, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Robert Royal, the editor-in-chief of The Catholic Thing, and the author of the book, The Martyrs of the New Millennium, published earlier this year. Hello, Robert. Thank you so much for joining us today.
I'm delighted to be with you, Amy.
Your first book about Christian persecution was published in the year 2000, titled The Catholic Martyrs of the 20th Century, and your latest book focuses on the persecution and martyrdom of Christians in the last 25 years. What first led you to research and write about this topic?
Well, actually, it just came about by chance because although I am a writer of many books, that particular book about the martyrs of the 20th century just fell together because there was a group here in the United States that had collected all sorts of stories and documents about martyrdom in the 20th century. And they wanted me to prepare a book for the Jubilee year, 2000, because on May 7, 2000, John Paul celebrated all the Christian martyrs of the 20th century. I gave him a copy of the earlier book that morning, and then there was a big celebration at the Colosseum. And of course, the 20th century martyrs were mostly produced by communism, and then to a lesser extent by Nazism and fascism. Aid to the Church in Need USA wanted to do a second edition of that book, but we quickly realized that it was just easier to do a new book for this 2025 Jubilee year because Pope Francis decided that he would reproduce what John Paul had done. We had planned to give him a copy of the book at a papal audience on May 8, 2025. Of course, he died before that. But I felt obliged, although I had many other projects actually in mind, I kind of felt obliged simply because most people don't realize how many Christians on every continent are being persecuted and in not a few cases killed for various reasons, even now in 2025. So I feel close to the contemporary martyrs, and it's always, in a sense, a kind of a labor of love when I turn to that topic.
Which are the most dangerous countries for Christians today?
Well, this is a slightly complicated subject because obviously North Korea is the most closed down anti-Christian place on earth. All the groups that follow the data just tell us it's even hard to get data out of North Korea. China, of course, is a big persecutor where we think that something like 10 bishops are just disappeared. We don't know whether they're dead. We don't know whether they're in prison, what's happened. But clearly the most dangerous country in terms of body counts, if we want to put it that way right now, is Nigeria. There are 5,000 Christians pretty much every year who we can reliably say have been killed by Muslim extremists in Nigeria and by other forces. And so I say that I finished my book in November of 2024, and probably 2,000 or 3,000 Nigerian Christians have died since then. I mean, we're only in June right now. So I think it's curious, but it's worth saying that in terms of being a priest, and this is an oddity for most people, in terms of priests, groups like Fides that keep track of missionaries and clerics who were killed, strangely, Mexico, which is a very strongly Catholic place, of course, Mexico in the past few years has been the most dangerous place to be a Catholic priest. And it's not persecution by the government or by radicals, it's criminality. It's the cartels, it's the drug traffickers, the human traffickers. And even there's unfortunately a kind of a parody group of devotion to the Virgin Mary called Santa Muerte, which is sort of a demonic criminal organization. So all those things come together in Mexico. Mexico still remains a very Catholic, very Christian country, but oddly for Catholic priests and also for other religious workers, it can be very dangerous.
One of the main findings of our Persecuted and Forgotten report, which you referenced in your latest book, was that most jihadist and Islamist extremist activity has now shifted to the continent of Africa. And yes, we have found that looking at the absolute numbers, Nigeria is objectively the most dangerous country for Christians. But it seems like a bit of a paradox that it's also the country where the church is growing the fastest. Vocations are booming. How would you explain that?
I can only say it's God working through martyrs, because, martyrs, when you think about this, a lot of people think that martyrs only existed in the distant past, during, under the Roman Empire. But there are lots of people who are willing to be persecuted, to suffer, and to die for Jesus Christ right in our time. And so, the old phrase of Tertullian that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, in a way, it's not surprising. I guess it is surprising, but from a religious standpoint, it also kind of makes sense that where people are willing to die for the faith, it shows that the faith is also strong. But you're right, it's very sad that the Islamic radicalism that we normally in the West associate with the Middle East, it migrated after the West kind of put a damper on ISIS in the 2010s, and although it's starting to come back again, unfortunately, it migrated into Central Africa. So it's the places like Nigeria, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Sudan, Somalia, and then also it's kind of moved out into the Far East as well. So you see it in Indonesia and even in the Philippines, which is another very Catholic country.
Yeah, it seems that mainstream culture and public knowledge takes a while to catch up with these facts, what you just mentioned as well. And that's why your work is so very important, because most mainstream outlets just don't talk about the persecution of Christians. As you said, people tend to think of martyrdom as a thing of the past. But if you just follow mainstream Western media, you're extremely unlikely to hear much about what's actually happening, especially in Africa, except for very exceptionally brutal cases like what we saw over last weekend. Up to 200 Christians were massacred in Benue State in Nigeria. It's a complex question, but why do you think the mainstream media generally fails to report on these atrocities?
Well, the last chapter in my book is about religious persecution and martyrdom in the West, and maybe we can talk about that in a second. But I think that there are two main reasons why we don't see this followed up in just normal reporting. When my first book came out, I actually used to write some book reviews for the Washington Post, which is our main newspaper here in Washington. They had a section called Book World, and I used to write occasionally reviews for them. And I talked to the editor one day when that book came out, and I said, look, in the same way that you document the Jewish Holocaust, and this is not on a level and not trying to equate these two things, but you document that because it's of interest as a secular matter that these things are happening in our world right now. So you should review my book. And God bless her, she did back then. But I think the tendency in the mainstream media is twofold. On the one hand, there's a kind of an implicit racism, if I can put it that way, that we don't really expect Africans to behave, or Middle Easterners to behave, or Asians to behave. It would be denied if you ever put that to a mainstream journalist. They would never say that, but they don't really care. If a single person is unjustly killed somewhere in the United States or the UK or the EU, we pay attention to it, especially if it's not for religious reasons. But I think the first reason that they don't pay attention is there is this kind of undercurrent of we don't expect them to behave like normal societies. But the second reason, and I think that this might be controversial even for some Catholics, but I believe that a lot of people in journalism who tend to be on the left kind of think that Christianity is evil. Or, it was anti-woman, or it was, it supported slavery, and then there were the crucifixions and the Inquisition, and there were crusades, and this kind of myth of the evil of Christianity, the Black Legend, as they call it in Latin America. I think that encourages a lot of people to say, well, Yeah, Christians are being persecuted, but you know what? They've done it themselves, and so, too bad. I know that that may seem harsh, but I think that combination of, in many parts of the world, thinking that we can't expect people to live up to civilized standards, and then the denigration of Christianity generally in the West. I think those two things account for a large part of why it is that our media don't cover what is obviously something that should be recorded at the very least. You don't have to necessarily overemphasize it, but at least recorded it, because it's what's going on in our time, even in secular terms.
Mm. Yeah, that's definitely spot on. Even in the UK context, we see people almost celebrating the decline of Christianity in the West because they see it as a thing of the past, a myth that belongs to the dark ages, the scary dark ages that people misunderstand, and they're almost happy when it's being torn down. But while you were researching and writing your latest book, were there any stories in particular that you found really shocking and that you really struggle to understand why, more people are not aware of, and why it's not being reported in the media?
Well, as I said earlier, some of these stories are just so inspiring. I remember after I did the first book, I gave a lot of lectures, and a woman once asked me, wasn't it depressing to be reading about all this as you were researching the book? And I said to her, it actually never crossed my mind. I'd never spent so much time with such holy and forgiving people. I mean, mostly martyrs are people who they're actually forgiving the people who are about to kill them, praying for them. It's an amazing group of people. So it's a little bit hard for me to pick out anyone in particular, but I think there's a priest in Iraq. His name was Raghib Ghani, and he was one of those priests. I mean, we all know this kind of priest he's brilliant, he's charismatic. He studied in Rome. He'd done a PhD. He actually did a PhD at the Angelicum, where I gave a presentation about the book a couple of weeks ago. And he was supported by Aid to the Church in Need. The Church in Need gave him a scholarship to study there. But he went back to Iraq after he did his PhD, and of course, it was in the period right after the American invasion, and the country was in chaos. And the bishop immediately made him his secretary because he clearly was a comer. He probably would have been a bishop very shortly, but he began to receive death threats. His parish was in the Mesopotamian plain, which is a historically Christian area of Iraq, if you know that area. And they would send him bullets in envelopes and call him up and threaten him. And before he was killed as he was traveling to get his passport or his driver's license renewed. He was killed. His car was shot up, and his bodyguards were also killed. But he stopped at his mother's and he gave her a video and said, "This is something to remember me by. You can use this at my funeral." I mean, what a really poignant thing. A man who clearly he could have gone back to Europe. He had an offer to work in a parish in Switzerland, but he chose to stay with his people. He said, if priests leave, who will be left? Who will take care of Christians? And of course, as you know, at Aid to the Church in Need, one of the biggest problems in the Middle East is historic Christian communities that are just disappearing. They're going elsewhere. And Aid to the Church in Need has been trying not only to rebuild where they've been destroyed, but try to encourage people to come back. So I think he's really a great witness, but there are so many others in my book. So.
Yeah, that's also very true about the Middle East. I visited Lebanon just a couple of weeks ago, and I was expecting to see a church crushed by conflict and crisis, exhausted, and that's really not what I saw. The people's faith there, the way the church is thriving, it was so incredibly moving and inspiring. And of course, young people are leaving, and the church just really cannot possibly do enough to give people a reason, especially young people, a reason to stay. But at the same time, we met really so many inspiring people. And I just want to quickly tell you this story because this just really brightened my day when I was in the Bekaa Valley, and we visited this community of monks, monastery, a new monastic community that was founded just 4 or 5 years ago. It was 23 young men, full of energy, radiating hope and faith in the most beautiful ways. The average age must have been in their early 30s, and they built their whole monastery with their own hands. They were just given this piece of land by the diocese, and they built everything themselves. And 2 of these monks were from Australia. So they were born to Lebanese parents in Sydney.
Wow.
And they discerned religious life, and they felt they were called back to their ancestral land. And they joined this monastic community. And then they witnessed the war, the ongoing war, the airstrikes, their monasteries overlooking the valley where they saw that, the missiles landing. But the community is really thriving, and it's just, I guess it really shows that the Holy Spirit is still at work, moving people to live out the faith in different ways. It was so beautiful to see that.
I noticed in a couple of places that I write about that the difference, I think, that we in the West perceive when we see these communities is, for them, the faith matters. It really, when you're willing to put your life on the line and to remain in a place where you know that you're in danger every day. In my first book, I said, back in the ancient world, the philosophers used to say, live every day as if it's your last, right? What these people often are facing is live every day as if you could become a martyr today. And I think that is a remarkable difference. And when we see them, we say, wow, that is how powerful the faith can be. Whereas in the West, we tend to think of it as just like an option that a person can choose. These people bet their lives on the faith.
And speaking of Christians in the West, what role do you think the Western Church should play in responding to the persecution of Christians?
Well, first of all, look, we need ourselves to take care of our own people here. We need to make sure that people understand that this is going on. I run across a lot of people they don't believe it. They just kind of think that this is, it's an odd thing happens here, an odd thing happens there. No, I mean, this is a constant threat. If you live in Lebanon, or you live even in Israel, or if you live anywhere in the Middle East, Central Africa, in the Far East, this is a fact of daily life. And I think the first thing that we can do, and recent popes, all of the recent popes have done this, is keep constantly reminding Christians that this is happening. I also think people should concretely be aiding to the church in need, frankly, by donations and whatever, if they want to volunteer or whatever they can do. But we need to have some concrete engagement with Christians around the world with whom we're in solidarity. Well, we're all part of the mystical body of Christ. But the other thing is, I think we need to put pressure on our governments. I'm very disturbed that the Biden administration here in the United States took Nigeria off the countries of particular concern, the CPC. I know you know about this. Very few people do. But the United States has this list of countries that it, by keeping a country on this list of countries of particular concern, our Congress and our executive administration can also do certain things to try to shape what is happening inside the country. We can ask the government of Nigeria, for example, or even a place like Nicaragua to treat their Christians better. And unfortunately, I think because of a combination of lobbying, and Nigeria is a very wealthy country by African standards. I think it is the wealthiest country just in terms of, the amount of oil and raw materials that it sells, diamonds, gold, whatever, the minerals might be. And so certain interests don't want there to be any pressure on the government. They want to do business. They want to have nice relations. I think that has to stop. And we need to also keep pressure on China. Unfortunately, I think the church, with this so-called secret accord, this unpublished accord that we have, is in a very sticky situation for talking about what's happening to bishops and even ordinary believers in China these days. But look, we have a responsibility. We're in the free world. We can speak. We can do a podcast like this. People can make donations to organizations, not just Age of the Church in Need. There are lots of other organizations out there as well. I particularly like Age of the Church in Need because I think you're very effective and you're everywhere. But we can't just walk away from this. You can't just turn away from it and say, oh yeah, that's not my concern. I think that this is this should be front and center in our understanding of what the position of Christians in the world is. And actually, I also, in that last chapter on persecution in the West, I talk about how we need to be vigilant in our own countries.
I think people, as you say, have a tendency to just turn their head, look the other way, away from suffering. A lot of people probably feel like they have enough suffering going on in their own lives. Why should they care? Why should they care about what's happening to people in faraway places that they couldn't even point to on the map? So what would you actually say? Like, why should Christians in the West care?
Get out a map and look at it, because it will come here, and it has. You know, I in that last chapter, I talk about the way that I think a lot of people know about the murder of Father Jacques Hamel in France, in Normandy. These were two young Muslims in France who had been radicalized by the internet, and they just walked in to a mass that he was offering one morning, cut his throat, stabbed a couple of parishioners. A lot of people know about that. But at the very same time, shortly thereafter, I think, down in Nice in France, southern France, there were 3 people who were stabbed at a Catholic mass. There have been similar events that have been going on in Italy, in Germany, in Spain, in Portugal. And then there's the kind of, I think, low-level persecution, or I should say that, you know, I know that in England you talk about this 2-tiered policing, that somehow there are these cases where if you're praying silently near a abortion clinic, somehow you can be put in jail. There's a case in the British Midlands of 4 boys who were carrying a Quran. They actually wanted to know about Islam. They were carrying a Quran to school one day, and one of them dropped it by accident. And there was a rumor got started that they had torn up and desecrated a Quran, and it was blasphemy. And the whole town went up in an uproar. The kids had to be sent away from school. The local imam had to try to calm everyone down. I mean, I don't like anyone who disrespects a sacred text. I wouldn't want to see people disrespect the Bible, an Old Testament or New Testament. But we can't be having blasphemy laws like they have in Pakistan because somebody so-called desecrated a Quran in the British Midlands or in the United States or in France or whatever this is going to be. And then there is, I think, just the phenomenon of there are subtle attacks on Christianity. France actually works at protecting Christian sites. They have a lot of Christian sites, obviously, in France, but they lose, on average, a couple of religious buildings a month, 2 a month. There was a plot when Notre Dame was being restored. It was just almost restored. There was a plot that the French police stopped. There was a radical Islamic group that was going to try to burn it down again. I mean, you can imagine what that would have caused if it had happened. But even here in the United States, we're not immune from this. Our bishops did a study of anti-Catholic activity, by which they mean, you know, arson or vandalism, etc., between 2020 and 2024, just 4 years. And there were almost 500 incidents of that here in the United States. I mean, these are things that people don't pay much attention to. But I think we need to be vigilant because there is, as we said earlier, there is a kind of an undercurrent of, you know, Christianity was this evil thing in the past. Is obviously a ridiculous distortion of the history of all the good things that Christianity did. But I think it becomes a pretext for a lot of people who are, you know, they're opposed to the church for reasons of it's anti-LGBT, they think, or it's anti-women, or, you know, whatever it might be. This cannot be allowed to continue. We need to be quite sure that we protect ourselves in our country. And one of the ways that we do that is by making it clear that this isn't just a local complaint, that it's something that is happening everywhere in the world. And I tried to document that in this book.
On a more spiritual level, what message would you like readers to take away from your book? In what ways do you think Christians in the West can learn from these stories or can be inspired by them?
Yeah, you know, the recent popes have, as you know, in the introduction of my book, I talk about how recent popes have actually refined the idea of what it means to be a martyr, because modern conditions are different from ancient conditions. We know about the persecution of the Roman Empire. And that's what most people think of. It's in odium fidei, that the people hated the faith, either because it conflicted with the pagan gods or was a threat to Rome. John Paul came up with a second category. He called it the nuovi martiri, the new martyrs. And I include some of them in my book. People who, for example, in Sicily resisted the mafia. They're very poignant cases of people who were doing secular work. I think in particular of one judge, Rosario Livatino was his name, who wrote quite a bit. And there actually is a Rosario Livatino Center now in Sicily, trying to talk about Catholic social thought. He often spoke about how, yes, he was an anti-mafia prosecutor at first, and then also a judge. But in carrying out his secular duties, he was doing it because of a religious commitment. And I think that's what John Paul II was trying to get at. Pope Francis came up with a third category, which is the offering of your life, kind of on the spur of the moment. We see there's a famous case of this in Lahore, Pakistan. In the middle of Lent, a church guardian was standing outside of a church on a Sunday, and an Islamic suicide bomber was about to enter, and he grabbed him and said, "I will die, but you will not enter." I mean, this is the offering of your life on the spur of the moment. We understand when people have put themselves in difficult circumstances, but I'm sure that day Amir Bakash woke up and didn't think that he was going to have to offer his life in order to protect Catholics who were worshiping inside a church. So there are these different refinements that, if you start to look carefully at what's going on in the reasons why people die, because there are Muslims who think of themselves as martyrs. There were people who thought of themselves as martyrs for the cause of communism, so for some very bad causes. But if you begin to study this, I think it inspires you, and it lifts up your own sense of what it means to be a Christian in the world. Because as Jesus himself said, they persecuted me and they will persecute you. He isn't saying that they might persecute you. He says they will persecute you. And so we've been fortunate in the West that for many years we've kind of been able to live happily and not expect that there are going to be anti-Christian, anti-Catholic elements in our societies. But I think that day has passed, and that we need to be, I keep using the word vigilant, but I think that we need to do that, but also we need to prepare ourselves in whatever way that might present itself, to be willing to sacrifice. It might be just standing up to somebody who's an anti-Christian bigot. It might become something more substantial than that. But I think that this is going to be part of the history of all of us in the West, as well as it is in other parts of the world now.
Well, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for writing this book. And also thank you for your kind words about ACN. We really, really appreciate your support.
I'm not flattering. I mean, I really, I feel myself blessed to be able to work with ACN. And I think anybody who works for ACN should feel the same way.
I definitely feel blessed to be able to work with ACN here in the UK. And I'd like to ask our listeners to please follow our podcast on your favorite platform. Please follow us on various social media platforms that you use. And you can also subscribe to our weekly newsletter, our ACN UK newsletter, for the latest breaking news about persecuted Christians around the world. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for your time, Robert. It was lovely talking to you.
My pleasure.